You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. How comfortable are you with AI giving you the news? The Tacoma News Tribune, Tri-City Herald, Bellingham Herald, and Olympian. For over a century, all of these local papers have brought in-depth reporting and local news to their communities. But new policies instituted by publisher McClatchy Media have left reporters at the paper worried that the company is adopting artificial intelligence tools for efficiency's sake at the cost of accurate information. Union members from the Idaho and Washington State Newsguild, a group of 5 McClatchy-owned papers in the region that include the 4 from Washington and the Idaho Statesman, are demanding that the publisher change its policy over how it uses artificial intelligence to produce and collate content. Here to explain is Christine Sherrod, food reporter at the Tacoma News Tribune and chair of the Washington State Newsguild. Christine, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege.
So how exactly is McClatchy using AI in its newsrooms right now, just to be clear?
Essentially, what we know on the ground, one of the main ways they've been using it for going on about a year now, I would say, is in what are kind of like listicle type stories, roundups that are essentially, they usually have a headline like 7 businesses that closed this year. And what they are is kind of a collation of 7 stories that had been written and reported by us, by real human reporters. And then the AI is kind of pulling those stories from our collection and then putting them into one file and writing an AI-generated, usually 1 or 2 sentence summary. And it does link to the original story.
So what is concerning to you about that? If it uses the reporting from actual people and it's kind of summarizing things, what are the main concerns of the union?
Well, one is a lot of this stuff has been happening without our knowledge or consent to a certain extent. And there is kind of the caveat that as journalists employed full time at a news organization, or even if you were freelancing, the work that you create while on the job is copyrighted by the employer. So there is a little bit of nuance there. But in addition to kind of the questionable transparency with us about it, the AI has a tendency to conflate ideas. It loses nuance. It often lacks context. And in the case of these kind of even a 1-sentence summary of a 5 to 1,000 word news story just kind of loses a lot of the very specific decision making that you make as a reporter, coming down to things like word choice, right? That it might kind of say that a business closed because of, for instance, rising costs. But in reality, maybe the real reason that the business closed was because the family decided to move out of state, right? And the first article, the real human reported article, gets into those nuances, but the AI kind of truncates it into this one quick thought. And what we've found with these listicles is that this kind of happens a lot. There have been instances where there was a straight up error. In Boise, there was a brewery that had been contemplating closing for a variety of reasons. And my colleagues at the Idaho Statesman reported a story about their, strains, essentially. Some time passed and the brewery had turned a corner and it's still open and fully operating. But this AI-generated listicle that are allegedly, according to the company, always reviewed by human editors, had been put out into the ether. And the only reason that it came to the attention of the newsroom was because readers reached out and were like, this brewery isn't closed.
Oh, the AI had published saying that it closed.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So it was corrected. This particular listicle had 8 businesses listed originally, and now this link, which is still live and available on the internet, now says 7. So that story was just pulled out of this listicle by a human. But the brewery owner has said, the damage was sort of done to a certain extent. Like once something is out on the internet, it kind of has a way of living there, even if you try to fix it. And then the worst kind of element of that was that the editors in Idaho declined to issue a formal correction to that story, which would be normal practice in our newsrooms.
Even though there was an error, there was no correction made? I mean, the item that was incorrect was removed, but no actual correction issued.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
And that was a one-off situation. To be fair, we haven't encountered that kind of sort of egregious example time and again. But in our studying of these listicles at the Guild, what we've found is that there's, essentially what I would sort of define as misinformation or just misleading information, like sort of to that business example that I gave that, anybody who follows small businesses especially knows that there's myriad reasons why something closes, and the AI has a tendency to kind of just lose all of the context that you as a human would put into it.
Christine, is there an indication for readers when they're reading something made by AI?
Yes. So that is one thing that McClatchy has generally been doing, is disclosing at the top of the story where you would usually see a byline that what you'll see below has been AI generated with, review by our newsroom editors. It says something to that effect. So yes.
What is the problem if readers know it and they can choose whether they want to read something made by the AI? Why are you concerned about this?
Well, I think to that Boise brewery example, the company has so far been testing these various tools. This is just one example of how they've been using it to generate content that is, public facing, that you as a regular person maybe coming to the News Tribune site or the Bellingham Herald site might stumble into one of these stories. And the company says that they're reviewed by editors, and in what they have told us from kind of the top down, they really emphasize that idea. But the truth is that, these are really strapped newsrooms. We're smaller than we've ever been. In some cases, there's quite literally just a small handful of people in each newsroom trying to cover cities that used to be covered by dozens of people, both reporters and photographers and editors and all the rest. What we're seeing, though, is that editors, while yes, they probably are looking at these things, we're kind of left wondering, how closely are you looking at them, right? And if this is where we're starting, what happens when the pace of use of these AI tools, whether it's, kind of on the back end for the purposes of reporting, which is kind of a different bucket, and then these public-facing AI-generated actual content that is being put out there on the internet. Another example, McClatchy has begun using something called key takeaways, essentially these little boxes at the top of stories that...
Very Axios coded.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's essentially just like that for anybody who's familiar. Just like 3 or 4 bullet points that summarize what the story is about. And these are being generated. We have to add them manually to our stories, but the content, the copy within them is generated from what is in the file. And this just so happened to have happened to me that one of my stories, an editor placed this key takeaways thing at the top of my story. And I read the story because I'm sort of OCD and reread everything I write to make sure that it's 100% accurate all the time. And I noticed that the summary points were just off, off in a misleading way in a couple of cases. And then in one case, it just misstated the date that, in this case, it was a business that had changed hands and the new owner had bought it in 2025, but it said he had bought it in 2024. And the editor basically admitted that this person hadn't really looked at it.
The factual accuracy that we're talking about here, even though the AI tools, what they generate, are supposed to be reviewed. So you are currently in your next union contract. And I feel like I should disclose here that the KUOW staff that's on air that you hear is also unionized, but we are under SAG-AFTRA, a different union. How are the union contract negotiations going for you, and what are you asking for from McClatchy?
So we've been negotiating with McClatchy since June of last year, so June 2024. And generally it's been going okay, I'd say. But there are some main kind of sticking points that usually always come back to the company wanting the flexibility to do what it wants, when it wants, and the guilds trying to protect, the people who are here. But there are kind of three major elements that we have been fighting for and are kind of taking the longest time. And those include layoff protections and pay, of course, production, including story quotas, essentially, and then obviously AI. And the AI is the only kind of brand new element to the contract, which just speaks to how rapidly this technology is moving.
And what are specifically you asking for when it comes to AI?
We have, well, been wanting to just get it in the contract because at the moment we're living in a contract status quo situation that doesn't mention AI at all that was signed in 2022. And we want to, ensure that AI doesn't replace us. That's kind of first and foremost, that it doesn't replace guild work. And that's even more important in the news because most research so far shows that people really don't trust AI in the news, at least not yet in these early stages. The other important factors we're seeking with AI protections include transparency, both with us internally and then also externally. We mentioned the disclosure to readers, and now there is an AI policy that is available on our websites. But the kind of battle that we're fighting with trying to get a lot of these specific guardrails into our collective bargaining agreement have to do with sort of timing of prior human review, which has been something of a sticking point, essentially giving reporters a chance to ensure that what the AI is doing with their work is being done in a way that is fair and accurate. Nobody knows the story better than the person who reported it. But
basically, a reader should never think, I'm reading a reporter's work, but in fact, they're reading the AI.
Correct. There's kind of a lot of those kinds of things where it's not that McClatchy has done these things or that we even think that they would, but the only way that we can guarantee that it doesn't impact the integrity of the work that reporters do every day is to put it in the contract, because the only thing we have right now is an internal company policy that we basically have no control over. And that can change at any time. So right now, the company says that they're not going to do certain things in their own AI policy, but who's to say they can't change that? And we can enforce the contract, but we as guild members or as just newsroom employees can't enforce it unless it's written out clearly in our CBA.
Christine, we tried to reach out and get a statement from McClatchy or get a response to this story. They have not responded yet, but I did want to read a little bit of the policy that we found on the Miami Herald's website from McClatchy when it comes to AI. They say in cases where the technology significantly impacts content, McClatchy newsrooms are required to err on the side of transparency. Editors have complete control and oversight of content, can make adjustments at any time. They track the accuracy, quality, and results of new journalistic tools. They immediately make improvements, they say, when necessary, and are quick to end automation that does not meet our standards. That's what we could find from McClatchy. I just want to end on this thought. I mean, I'm in a unionized newsroom shop. You're in a unionized newsroom shop. You're in negotiations. Is this about protecting reporter jobs? Is this something that, you're basically fighting against these inevitable tools of efficiency, which are going to potentially put some of us out of our work? And, can you kind of approach this without a hefty dose, I guess, of bias because of that?
That's a really good question.
Because I know you and I, like in this line of work, we really try to check that. But when it comes to what it's going to mean for the news business, it's really hard for us, right?
Right. I think in my conversations with other news outlets about this, and also internally, and even on a very personal level in the past year or so, dealing with this both on the ground as a reporter and then also as a leader of our guild, I have tried to sort of check my own concerns to a certain extent. And at first, I would say that like my sort of inherent skepticism as a journalist was extremely high. And to a certain extent, that hasn't abated. But there are a lot of ways that AI can be used for good. But the question of whether that actually happens remains very up in the air. On the back end, there's a lot of ways that AI could benefit our reporting to, simplify tasks that are really tedious. But I don't know that the replacement of reporters is necessarily, at least at the moment, our biggest concern. I think it's more that how rapidly does AI infiltrate our news? And is that a good thing, right? Who is it benefiting? Did anybody ask for this? Do people want to read AI generated listicles of stories that are reported by humans? Maybe.
And are they accurate?
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty big question in the journalism world. Yeah.
Yeah. And as a union, I keep coming back to the idea that if there were no unionized newsrooms, I would be really, really scared for our country, as if we, maybe shouldn't be already. So we are kind of, not just in Washington State and in Idaho, but, we are also following in the footsteps of dozens of other news outlets across the country that just within the past couple of years have been fighting to add AI protections. SAG-AFTRA also, that was a big to-do just a couple of years ago as well. And at the end of the day, we are seeking transparency internally and transparency externally. And also, factual accuracy. We have to be really careful about objectivity. There's plenty of stories out there already about a lot of AI technologies not being good at objectivity. Word choice matters. Any journalist or writer knows that you could spend an hour talking about one word, but it really, really matters. And so far, just what we've seen kind of on the ground in our newsrooms and what we're hearing kind of from the top down at McClatchy is a purported desire to be transparent, but there have just been so many twists and turns that the company hasn't necessarily been particularly transparent with us. And there's a big question of, if you can't be honest with the people you employ, how can we expect the transparency to filter down to readers who at the end of the day are the people we serve?
Christine Sherrod is the food reporter at the Tacoma News Tribune and chair of the Washington State Newsguild. Really appreciate the conversation, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.